This is Shop Talk with writers.
Hello and welcome to Shop Talk with Writers, a podcast where authors tell us the stories behind their books. I'm Elena Lapin, and my guest today is novelist, screenwriter, and podcaster extraordinaire Caroline O'Donoghue. Check out her brilliant and very funny podcast, Sentimental Garbage. Born in Cork, Ireland, but currently living in London, Caroline O'Donoghue is the author of several best-selling novels, including The Rachel Incident, and also of YA fantasy fiction series. Her new novel in that genre is Skip Shock, the story of two teens finding their way in a dystopian world where the dimension of time depends on where and who you are. Enjoy. Caroline O'Donoghue.
Hello.
Welcome to Shop Talk with Writers.
I know this is welcome, but it feels like welcome back because you had a different podcast many years ago, and it was one of my first ever interviews I ever did as a published author.
Was it?
So this feels like an amazing catch-up, sort of 7-8 years on.
So I actually had to look it up because I couldn't remember how long ago it was, because it was before COVID.
Yeah.
Long before COVID.
2018, right?
18. And COVID kind of took years out of our lives, created this kind of black hole of lost time. So I couldn't remember when it was. So it was 2018, and it was your debut novel called Promising
Young Women.
Yes. And I loved it. I remember it was a completely different podcast, but if anyone wants to hear it, that podcast doesn't exist, but it is obviously still out there. The internet doesn't allow anything to die.
Yeah, maybe we'll link it in the show notes here or something.
So it's still out there. It's on Spotify. And I was so impressed with how you handled such a serious topic in such a fun way. Promising Young Women was very modern, but there was also a bit of a kind of almost like a classical voice about it. Like,
wow.
I loved it, and I was surprised that I was surprised that you were surprised that I took it very seriously.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
I do remember that. It was interesting because I re-listened to that interview again today in preparation for this, and I've been so excited about this because it does feel like, I haven't seen you or spoken to you in 7 or 8 years or whatever it is. And it feels like a lovely kind of a check-in, you know what I mean? Like, because so much has happened in my life personally and professionally since then. And it felt, people always say like, oh, you've come so far, and you view that in a kind of distant way. But to review a conversation that you had with a total stranger 8 years ago, and then you come back and it feels very special, actually, to check in with you like this, because I remember being so nervous about that podcast and having such a great time. And I remember, it was such a blessing to be interviewed by you at that point in my career, because I didn't feel like I was taken very seriously by anyone else.
Why was that?
Yeah, and the why was that has actually informed my career since a lot. It's informed a lot of what I do on Sentimental Garbage, my podcast, which is about women's culture and women's kind of media and like why it's not taken seriously. But I felt like it was what I was trying to do with that book was, and I haven't looked back into it in a very long time, but I really wanted to combine a love of like Victorian literature and Gothic literature specifically with a contemporary voice, and the kind of. And I really hope people would get that, and you got that, and a few other people did. But the majority of the feedback I got at the time, it was very pigeonholey, I suppose. It was either, this is the Irish Lena Dunham, or this is Fleabag, or this is Sally Rooney, or this is whatever. And this kind of didn't seem to take seriously the references I was actually working with, which is fine, because like you can't, like, there are so many debut novelists a year, and they all seem to be 28-year-old women, as I was, and you can't like dedicate your life's work to understanding each and every one of them, but you kind of did, and I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that you appreciated it, because it was probably one of my favorite interviews from that time.
Really?
Definitely. It was to me, it was a really excellent contemporary literary novel with a very light touch, playful touch, but very serious. And I think all of your novels in that vein are like that. So let's address the elephant in the room, which is how on earth do you do everything that you do? Because since then, so we're looking back at 2018, since then, we're now in 2025, you have written 2 more novels that are literary novels. You've written 3, shall we call them YA fantasy novels. New York Times best-selling author. You have a podcast, which is, you're giving me podcast envy, to be honest, because it's incredibly popular. Everybody loves it. The Rachel Incident was the first book. I don't even have to say no, but the first book that my daughter was able to read after having her first baby. Wow. She wasn't yet really, she's a great reader, but she was kind of easing her way back into reading. And that was the first book that she took out of the library, and she kept reading it until she was done. I don't know how long it took. She was breastfeeding, so it was like kind of night reading sometimes.
Oh, I love that, because the hero is a new mother and a pregnant woman,
Exactly.
I love hearing when new mothers are reading that book.
Exactly. And so, but the funny thing is, I saw Rachel Incident, I wasn't really connecting it with you. And then I said, oh, wait a second, Rachel Incident, Caroline O'Donoghue. Yeah. Is it the same? I couldn't believe that it was you, because not that long had passed since then. And now we are here to talk actually about a new YA novel called Skip Shock. So your literary novels, or the adult novels, are published by Virago, Little Brown, and your YA fantasy novels are published by a different publisher, Walker Books. I'd love to know how your mind works. How do you go from one type of writing to a completely different type of writing? And is there a link?
It's interesting because sometimes, God, thank you for that. Oh, God, yeah. This really, again, this really does feel like a retrospective of the last however long. It's funny because sometimes I'll be, on the first draft of an adult novel, and I'll be editing a YA, or vice versa. I'll be, because obviously these things go through many different stages, and you think you're done with the project, and then it pings back from your editor, and you have yet more changes to make and all that stuff. And it'll be interesting because my style or my tone of voice will start to bleed and blend a bit between projects, and then suddenly you'll be reading an adult contemporary passage where a character will be described as having raven black hair or something, which is a kind of a phrase you'll only really see in YA, which is kind of why I love YA, is that kind of it can lend itself to that sort of aesthetic drama, which I'm very fond of. But it's interesting because in terms of how I got here, I feel like the first 2 novels that I wrote, Promising Young Women was the first, and Scenes of a Graphic Nature was the second. A novel that did so poorly, my Wikipedia page does not even acknowledge it. It's in on the wind. It's in the dust. I don't think it's even earned out. It's quite small.
Well,
advanced.
I had mine removed, so
really,
I don't want one. I really don't want one.
You don't want a Wikipedia page?
I don't want one at all. Never.
Why does it just feel like surveillance state?
Well, it's a whole separate story, but they are rarely actually descriptive of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, no, you're right. I get that is a subject for the day. But and I felt like those first 2 novels, as much as anyone's early career, you're watching them learn how to write a novel, because unless they're doing an MFA or something, it is very much a self-taught discipline. There's no apprenticeships, there's no internships for writing a novel, and so I was sort of muddling my way through, but I felt like the feedback I often got from critics, which I think is a very fair piece of feedback, was that it was muddled in the sense that, there are these sort of what feel like quite sharp social observations. For example, the observations around and discussions of sexuality in the workplace in Promising Young Women, or around heritage and identity in Scenes of a Graphic Nature, which would then butt up against kind of special effects, essentially. What I always call them special effects is that, in Promising Young Women, the love interest kind of is vaguely kind of gothic, vampiric sort of sense, and there's kind of a sense that he's literally a vampire, even though the novel never comes to an exact conclusion on that. And Scenes of Graphic Nature, it starts out as a kind of a buddy comedy, and it kind of gets very... There's fires and there's, slavery. there's all kinds of quite dark, quite big, somebody's waterboarded at a certain point, I believe. And there was all this kind of, because I really felt like there was two kinds of writers inside of me.
I've never heard anyone say waterboarded with such fun.
The joy. Yeah. Chicken soup for the waterboarder's soul. And so there was a sense that, like, I from both critics and also myself, that there were two writers stuck inside one writer, which is one of them wants to write literary fiction and the other one wants to write genre, and then I started writing young adult, and I was, they did quite well, really. They really quite well. The first one was a New York Times bestseller, as you said. And I felt so happy that I was able to pour all my instincts for special effects and instincts for sort of, villainry and set pieces and kind of like big, cool moments that feel aesthetically cool, but also to write the themes into them that I wanted to. And then by the time I did that trilogy, and then by the time I wrote my next literary novel, which was The Rachel Incident, it was like I had drained the swelling or something. It was like all of my special effects had a good channel to go down, and then I just had the table set for a clear literary novel. So I feel like writing in two genres has really improved my skills with each. And now this novel, Skip Shock, it's not my first fantasy novel, but it's my first kind of high fantasy novel, if you know what I mean. It's the first one that's set in like a totally separate universe. The All Our Hidden Gifts books were set in a kind of an urban gothic kind of environment. So yeah, it was, all of these complement each other, I guess.
So Skip Shock, would you say science fiction? Is it pure fantasy? Is it dystopian? Because as I was reading it, there was so much in it that was completely recognizable. I mean, they have Amazon.
Yeah.
As in, the place where you can buy stuff, not the river, although you reference both. They are teenagers with the sort of spirit of a teenager, which implies a certain kind of lifespan. They take public transport, they buy tickets, they know weather, they know there are destinations. There's a protagonist who travels originally from Cork to Dublin. Real places. The whole thing is actually called Ireland. So how much of your actual Ireland and your personal trajectory is in that story? Because if I remember correctly, you were born in Cork?
Yeah, I was born in Cork. It's interesting because the novel is told between two perspectives. Margot, who is an Irish girl from Cork, who is, after a string of kind of personal tragedies and sort of mental health issues, has been sent by her mother to a boarding school. And it's your classic, there's something very, of a piece of children's and YA fiction of like a character going to boarding school, and it's, I like my references,
Is that something you've done?
No, God, no.
How did you, can I just step aside from the book for a moment? How did you grow up in Cork? What was your experience? Let's say up to that point in your life. She's 16, maybe 17?
16, okay, so I was the youngest of four kids. Big family, 4 kids and 2 parents is probably a big family by today's standards. I feel like most of my friends are one of 2 children, but it was a big family numbers wise, but a big family everything else wise as well, in terms of everyone is big, everyone has a big personality. Everybody is, fighting for their own scrap or whatever. It was like, I always think I kind of got into writing because it was a way of like guaranteeing that you'll be heard by someone, kind of thing. It's because when you're the smallest voice, it's sort of hard to feel heard a lot of the time. And like, especially when you're the youngest, I'm not sure where you fall in your family. Everybody has gone through every milestone you have gone through, and they're looking at you hitting these, like, oh, Caroline's got her first kiss, Caroline's going to her first disco, or going to secondary school, whatever. Everyone's looking at you with a degree of like natural condescension, because you're the baby and you'll always be the baby. And I took myself extremely seriously, and I felt like this was like writing was the only place where I could be taken seriously by myself or something.
Even at that age, were you writing?
Yeah, I was.
Was it fantasy?
Do you know what? It was like when I was a kid in primary school, I was always that kid who was going to be a writer, always. And I was, it was sometimes it was fantasy, sometimes it was dragons, and sometimes it was like more Jacqueline Wilson inspired sort of teen pregnancies and social issues type of stuff. And then I remember... And I think there's a reason why I tend to stick in this age a lot, because Margot is 16 and the characters in All Our Hidden Gifts were about, I think we have them between 15 and 17, is that it was the time I stopped believing in myself, I think. I don't know, I just sort of like, I went from being this quite sparky little kid, I think, to, I remember quite specifically saying at that age, I remember thinking I wanted to be a writer, but no, I think I want to marry one, which is so depressing to me now. I got really into, I think I really didn't like school because I just couldn't academically focus in that era. For whatever reason, it wasn't the kind of learning I was able to do. So I was getting sort of D's and F's in almost everything, apart from maybe English, which might be a high C. I was really getting into sort of, being a bit of a stoner, sort of skipping school a lot, the classic sort of thing. And then I felt so dim and silly and dumb and awkward. But I had this string of older boyfriends that were all kind of into the arts.
Older by how much?
Sometimes by 2 years, sometimes by 8 or 9 years, sometimes like fully adult men. And I remember thinking I could be this sort of accessory to somebody else's world for a while. And I just sort of disappeared for a while. And I think it's kind of why I focus on that age group so much in my work. And it's funny, I always make sure whenever I'm writing a book for teenagers that I include a sex scene. Or if not a sex scene, then a heavy petting scene or whatever. Because I really want kids to, because in my experience with a lot of stuff aimed at that age group, it's like, and it's changing now with, I don't know if you're familiar with kind of the romantasy genre, where there's a lot more sex and sexuality in fantasy. But when I was growing up, there was a lot of stuff that was like, sex was always portrayed as very scary, like something that preluded a teen pregnancy often, or something that girls were bullied into or whatever. And I feel like, without getting into it in too much detail, I felt like I spent so much of those years obsessed with boys and how they saw me, and therefore sexually betraying myself a lot, doing things I didn't want to do, or finding myself in situations I didn't want to be in, and pretending to be other people. And like, I just feel, and so I always want to put a positive scene about a girl enjoying herself, a girl having an orgasm at 16, because I want to show people it's possible.
Can be done.
It can be done, and it doesn't. You don't have to settle for whatever comes up.
So what's very interesting in Skip Shock, this novel, is, and I have to say, I don't differentiate between genres. I don't care if a book is this genre or that genre. I just care about how honest it is, how real it is, how the author's voice really connects with the story and with me. And in this case, again, I couldn't care less whether it's YA in terms of where it's being, how it's being sold, marketed, placed. For me, it's just a wonderful novel about actually very adult seeming emotionally experienced teenagers. They are all actually still teens. Your main characters. They are quite. So. Let's just introduce the two main protagonists. We have Margot, about whom you write in third person, which is very interesting because Margot usually knows what the reader knows.
Yeah.
Whereas Moon, the male protagonist, whom she at first perceives as a man, she thinks he's a man, and only later does it dawn on her that he's actually practically her age, or not that much older. Another teen, really. They are very mature, and there is something in that maturity. He writes you, or he speaks in first person. You write him in first person, but he speaks in first person. It's a first person narrative and a third person narrative meshing, effortlessly. It really works.
I'm so glad you said that, because lots of people were like, "Are you sure?" I was like, "I'm sure." Yeah.
I was relieved that you did that, because it combined the two views that they have. They have such different views of the world in terms of their knowledge of what that world is, and how to communicate about it, because he knows what she doesn't know, and he may not know everything about her. So they're always looking out for information about where they happen to be. I want to talk about those worlds, or that world, in a moment. But I wanted to ask you, do you feel that today's teens, the teens today, are much more grown up than they were when you were growing up?
It's funny you should ask me this question today, actually, because I've just had my 16-year-old nephew staying with me for a week. He was doing work experience in he was doing work experience in my agent's office. This was my way to give him some Nepo baby status, getting a job in show business. And so he's been living with me. And so I've been hanging out with him nonstop, and I was completely taken aback by how wise he is, kind of thing, and his perspective on the world. And I am, whether he's special, I don't know. He's kind of the only 16-year-old that I know, but I'm genuinely fascinated by him. Do you have any teenagers in your life?
Yes, and I totally, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, we were going to say something.
Yeah, I there are ways in which nothing ever changes, for example. So he's really in that phase right now where anything old is good. Do you know what I mean? Where like he's discovering the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and anything
like it's ancient history.
Like it's ancient history, and like coming up to me and my husband being like, "You guys like the Red Hot Chili Peppers?" And we were like, "We were listening to them when we were your age. Like, why do you care about this?" And these little elements of being a teenager I completely forgot about, like that thing where you want to be different to your peers because listening to whatever's on the radio, like Sabrina Carpenter or Taylor Swift or whatever, is basic because everyone's doing it. But you don't really have the tools to find anything new, truly new yet, and you can't really find a scene yet. So what you do is things that were approved 40 years ago, you just sort of lose yourself in that, and that strange nostalgic instinct that I kind of forgot you had when you're that age, I found really fascinating. But he was also, I just found him so self-possessed, and everyone I introduced him to, he gave a very strong handshake to, and lots of eye contact. And here's what I found really fascinating. I asked him, because that this will date the podcast somewhat, but that show, Stephen Graham's show, Adolescence, I asked him, do you think there's anything true in that? Do you think that teenage boys of your age are getting influenced by Andrew Tate and all these YouTubers and all that? And do you think they hate girls and women? And he kind of wrinkled his nose and he said, no, so everyone I know makes fun of those guys and makes fun of the guys who watch those guys. And I was like, well, so who do you think that Andrew Tate is actually for? He was like, Andrew Tate is for balding 26-year-olds, not for me.
Exactly.
And then it made me remember when I was his age and all the boys I knew were getting into hip hop and rap music, and all the the parents were freaking out over like whether the boys would take all the talk about gang violence and misogyny and stuff at face value. But it's like, no, the boys just knew a good song when they heard one. They weren't going to go out and stab someone. You know what I mean? Like, there has to be it's always interesting to me when culture gets blamed for teen behavior and how much it's actually more of a smokescreen for how adults feel about themselves and their own worries, you know?
Well, something's changed and evolved. I mean, I can tell you that even toddlers today are very different from toddlers
really
10 years ago. They are like a whole new species. They are so evolved. So there's
in what way?
Oh my God, there's so much they know, so much they can do. They can take a phone and scroll at the age of 1, pretty much, and then they know what it's about, and they'll do this on a book.
Oh yes, the thumb and forefinger to pinch and
so these are sort of silly examples, but actually what they indicate is that their perception of reality has changed. For them, what's on the screen is real. And reality in your novel, in this novel, Skip Shock, is fascinating to me because although it is a fantasy and although it's potentially impossible, but everything is possible, I don't know, it's so believable. So she gets on a train, Margot gets on a train to go to Dublin from Cork to enter a boarding school, as you said. And then suddenly that train is not going where it's supposed to be going. That train changes. That train ends up looking different. That train becomes an empty train. And she ends up in a completely different dimension, in a different world. And there is a moment in that story where she's completely alone. By the way, it's so hard to talk about your book without revealing too much. And I should point this out because today is, the reveal day of the final episode of White Lotus. and all people talk about is
spoilers.
The reveal, the spoilers, so I'm trying not to reveal too much. So stop me if I'm saying too much.
Sure.
But I do want to say that there is a point when she feels completely alone on that train and possibly in the world because she doesn't know where she is. It reminds me of dreams I have, like recurrent dreams of waking up and finding myself completely alone in the world. There's no one around. Everything looks familiar, but nothing is because it's only me. I think that may actually be a very accurate teenage sensation of feeling you are yourself, but you're very isolated because nobody gets you.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Nobody really understands what's going on with you. And she is sort of in that moment very recognizable as a typical classic teenager. But then she meets another teenager who has been through incredible trauma and incredible losses and the things that happened in the world that he knows.
Yeah.
How did you work? How did your mind work on combining those two worlds and making them link up?
I like that you highlighted that exact moment, and it's about 15 pages in or whatever, when Margot has this realization where literally she's on a train, on a normal train and going from Cork to Dublin. She walks to the kind of snack car to get herself a bottle of water, and then the train just judders and she is stuck in that space on a train I'm always so scared of, which is like between between carriages, that kind of rubbery airlock place, and I always think something terrible is going to happen to me.
I never knew it had that name.
The airlock? Yeah.
It's a great name.
Yeah, I know, it's a scary name. And it reminds me of being an astronaut or something. You're going to get shot into space. And she has this kind of moment where it all shakes and it's all scary. And it's like, it's a kind of a physical moment. It's a special effects moment, right? And but then she has a moment to herself where she says, she was alone and she had, the train was kind of broken, and this it's better on the page, I promise, but kind of just like she was, like she had been a clean and well running thing for most of her life, and the last year or two that she's had has, bit by bit, parts of her personality have broken down and she's not able to run anymore, And I remember writing that thing, and even though Margot and I share almost no autobiographical details apart from both being Irish, I was like, oh yeah, that was it. It was like all this cockiness and swagger you have when you're a kid, and you know so clearly who you are. And then you kind of graduate into your adult body and people start treating you differently. The world starts treating you differently. And sometimes you're just not able to handle it, and just it breaks around you. Your old character breaks around you, you know. But then what I'm so interested in with this novel was that you have Moon, who's this character who has been living in these worlds that have been various sort of civil wars and society breakdowns have happened, and it's kind of a world that's barely managing to keep it together, and the way it's being kept together is under a very hardline system of sort of travel and visas and all that kind of stuff. And he said have a very hard life, and he experiences time in a different way also. So these series of interconnected worlds, think of them as like the European Union or something. They're like cultures that have very little.
She's got euros in her pocket.
She does, yeah. Yeah. There's the series of interconnected worlds that are connected by this train line. And if you think about, you know, the London train map, north, south, east and west, the further north you go on this train line, these worlds speed up. So there could be 2 hours in a day or 4 hours a day, 6 or 8. And the further south you go, the longer days get, right? And that means that if you are traveling in the northern quarter, you are aging far faster. So that's kind of like, and there you have the kind of the central conceit of the book. But what that does is that all these characters are teenagers, as you say, but they're all experiencing time differently, and they're all experiencing these worlds because time moves very fast. The concept of teenagehood and adolescence is far different. So someone is considered a legal adult by the time they are 12. And so Moon, who's about 19, is considered to be sort of like a man in his 30s kind of thing. That's how he thinks of himself. And I think what's fascinating to me about that is that, like, the conception of how young 15 is different all over the world, right? Like, if you're a 15-year-old girl in a middle-class background, you are this sort of pearl to be protected, right? If you're like a 15-year-old girl in another country, you could be considered bride material. If you're a 15-year-old man in some countries, you could be considered a thug, you know, depending on what kind of background you have or ethnicity you have. And like, we all have this elastic view on how much a 15-year-old can take. And I just loved playing with those two things.
Absolutely. And I love that moment when the first time she realizes that she is in a situation which is completely life-changing for her. And the way she takes control within that limited scope that she realizes she now has is by altering her appearance.
Yeah.
By creating, so she's wearing these rags at a certain point given to her.
Yeah.
But she makes a little change that she makes herself look a little bit more the way she thinks she would normally look. It reflects her character, her sense of style, even in that small moment of taking charge. And I really love that, because her world has changed so completely, and the reader is there with her. As I said, the third person totally allows the reader to follow her perspective throughout. We have just been, this podcast travels, and we have just been to Dublin, where we interviewed John Banville, and where we interviewed a young Irish author, Fiona Scarlett, on the same day, different incidents.
Yeah. And I love the John Banville interview, by the way.
Thank you.
You asking about young Irish authors? I don't read them.
And she, on the other hand, is very excited about the scene. You've been living in London for a long time, right? I don't know how long. How do you feel about the Irish literary scene and your connection with it personally?
It's fascinating because I feel I get I'm something of a cheat because I get the best of it, in the sense of, I truly do believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. Like, anyone who has the energy to be jealous in this line of work is wasting their time, because what they have to remember is that, like, books are sold in categories and on shelves and on tables. And if you liked this, you'll like this and all this kind of stuff. And so the amount of success there has been for Irish novelists of my age and background and gender, like, has been nothing but incredible for me. Like, it's like, and I love, I've got very close friends who are also Irish novelists, and it's been a boon. But I also have the advantage of not living in Ireland either. And that means I have all the opportunities that London affords, commercially speaking. Like a huge part of the reason that the Irish literary scene is as thriving as it is right now is that the country invested in it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure you had this, heard a lot about this in your trip to Dublin, but like, I kind of won't tolerate any conversation that's like, Irish people are good at writing because they just are. It's like, no, it's because the country decided it was important. Just because the arts are supported, it's because, we have all these kinds of grants and things. I'm not saying it's a paradise. It's not. And people do have their frustrations with it. And I think they would prefer to just be able to sell their books rather than have to rely on grants. But all the same, we've invested in it. That has created a pocket of talent that is extraordinary. And that is now so extraordinary, it's being farmed out abroad. But I haven't benefited from that system. I haven't been a part of it. I've been here since I was 21. I've been writing in the London system, if you will. And I think it's really fascinating because I think sometimes something I get asked a lot is, do you consider yourself an Irish writer or an English writer? People try and stick you with that. People are like, ooh, let's like a head, like, kind of a pull quote kind of thing, one thing or the other. And but I've been thinking about it a lot because, of course, I'm an Irish writer in the sense that I'm from Ireland. And I'm not an English writer because I'm not from England, and, obviously. But I am a London writer.
Yes.
And I think the kind of writer you are is defined by the people you are trying to sell to. Mm-hmm. And so for an Irish literary writer, for example, they will have a knowledge, even when they are on page 1 of their new draft, that if they can sell this to the Arts Council, they can possibly get up to 30,000 euros.
Really? Oh my God, really?
Yeah, and so
what would you have to put there?
Well, I mean, there's a sorry, I don't want to get in trouble with anyone, but like very lyrical prose. I think subjects that are important. I mean, I've never been a part of the Arts Council, so the funding system, I don't know. I'm guessing. Whereas if you come of age artistically in a place like London, you come of age artistically in a place where you saw David Nichols at a cocktail bar last week, and you've seen that he is a phenomenally famous, successful, talented person who also just gets cocktails like you do. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so that gives you the energy to go into your publisher, to go into Hachette and be like, listen, you had 1 day, I'll give you 2 days. Do you know what I mean?
Totally, yes.
And that totally changes what kind of work you create, I think.
Caroline, you said books are sold in certain ways.
Yeah.
I discovered, just because I spent a bit of time on Amazon recently, I discovered a whole new category, which is not, if you like this, you will like that, or, one purchase leading to another. But I discovered, and let me just quickly find that, a category entirely invented, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah. I remember one of my books, Scenes of Half Nature, was #1 in animal humor once.
Yes. Well, but this is not what that is. So let's just take the Rachel incident. Mm-hmm. And they have something, not what the readers say and so on, but they have a category called popular highlights in this book, which is what people highlight as they read the electronic version, the digital version of your book. I don't know if that applies to audiobooks as well, but certainly digital version, they highlight what they like. Those highlights are incredibly real. They are real responses, completely natural, unwarranted, human reactions to what you've just put in that
fascinating,
text.
right?
So let me give you some examples, and let me ask you, do you remember writing that passage?
Okay.
Because it's quite funny. After John Banville, for example, heard the reading that we had on the podcast, which wasn't done by him, he said, I don't remember writing it. And it's a very powerful one. But here's one. Now, this one was highlighted by 503 Kindle readers. When something good happens to you at that age, you can't settle with the notion that it's a one-off. You want it to be the beginning of a tradition. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. I was very proud of myself for that one.
Can you
Again, it wasn't that long ago.
Context?
The context of the story?
No, of that particular thought?
Yeah. But I think that's so. I mean, the character is 21 when she's saying that, and she's just after leaving this beautiful party, and you want it to be the beginning of many such evenings. And then she says, this is the part I was really proud of. She says, the truth was that would only happen one time, and by winter I would never see those people again, kind of thing.
Okay.
And and that's the end of the chapter. And I was very pleased with myself. I called lunch for the day, and I think,
is that how you write? When you reach a good point, you stop.
Yeah. Definitely. And I, in terms of the context of it, that's so. Are you a bit like that kind of thing? Where
yeah, definitely. That's the time to stop. When you reach a good sentence, bye.
Yeah.
See you again next time. Coming back to the good one, not the one that was problematic or that you
exactly.
need to
you got to have
rethink.
energy left in the tank, you know. And but in terms of that particular sentiment, I'm just so that type of person where if I go to the theater once by myself, I'll think, I'm the kind of person who goes to the theatre by themselves. And then I'll have this whole fantasy about myself as a doyenne of theatre. And in reality, that happened once, you know.
Caroline, this one's fascinating. This one was highlighted by 364 Kindle readers.
Okay.
But even then, what I liked most about reading was that I was good at it. I had taken to it quite quickly as a child. In the absence of any other discernible gift, it seemed like a fine thing to pursue, if only to receive more praise.
It's so funny that Kindle readers
Yes.
highlighted that being like, me too.
Yes, exactly. Is that something you had done?
I think so. I think,
I definitely was in love with myself as a reader, as a child.
it's in love
You
with
know?
myself as a reader, as a child. It's so that, isn't it? Because like, it's so, I mean, people, you know, insufferable people, they talk about how they read Moby Dick when they were 11 or something. And I'm like, really? But like, I do sort of believe it in that you pick up a big book when you're 12 or something. I remember reading East of Eden when I was 12. That's my insufferable thing. Reading East of Eden when I was 12. And it was hard. Of course it was hard. Like, Steinbeck is a pretty approachable writer, but not if you're 12. And it's a huge book. And it's got all these like biblical references that I wouldn't have got or whatever. But the thing that keeps you going is the image of yourself.
Well, I actually love that image of myself reading, and not just books, but sometimes newspapers. So I would walk down, this is at 14, I would walk down the street reading a newspaper thinking, I look amazing.
I look amazing.
Except what I didn't notice, because I was thinking of myself as looking amazing reading a newspaper, was that a young man was following me from across the street all the way into my building where I lived with my parents, obviously, and then assaulted me.
Oh my God.
And if I hadn't been reading like an idiot, I
I'm
would
so
have
sorry.
I would have noticed it. Well, nothing. I mean, I screamed and he ran away.
Right.
But it was very scary. But it only happened because I was posing as a reader.
And she never read a book again.
But
That's awful, though. I can't believe that.
But yeah, it was awful. But I wrote a piece about it on my Substack, kind of reflecting on, this was me at 14. He wasn't much older. He was maybe 17, 18, a teen as well. My life went a certain way, and I've never forgotten that.
Yeah.
If I bumped into him now, would he be someone who remembers doing things like, did he go on doing even
I think
worse?
about that all the time.
You know?
Yeah.
How do those people live? What are their lives like?
Yeah.
But this particular bit made me want to ask you, do you think when you write fiction of any kind, are we writing to make it recognizable to readers as something like these people who highlighted your passages to recognize themselves in? Or are we really expressing something they don't know, something new, something that will give them a clue or a method maybe to look at the world differently?
Well, it can't be. It can't be one or the other, right?
Could be both.
It has to sort of be a blend of the two. It's interesting because, you know, we live in this world where everything is ranked and rated out of 5, right? Like, and I keep getting this. I had made an insurance claim for my phone the other week. Keep getting an email about having to rate that out of 5, and why? How? But yeah, you know, you're whether or not you'd have to be pretty disciplined as a writer to not find out what people think of you. You know, in general, and these words that that come up so much in book reviews. Yeah. Is things like relatable, as you just said. Relatable and likable are these two phrases that come up a lot, especially I think in female-centric fiction kind of thing, whatever you want to call it. I think it's fairly understood now that the majority of people who are reading novels are women. And I think there's a lot of bad novels I've read that they are squarely going for that relatability thing. And they're generally novels that are pitched as being funny that aren't funny. And it's a bit like, you know, this is mean. This is mean. But I read a novel the other day, and I was just lying on my couch reading it on a Sunday afternoon or whatever. And I kept just saying, every time that the writer pointed out that she had like signed for her Amazon delivery, or she had, you know, attended yoga and hated every minute of it, or whatever, I just said out loud to myself, oh, what a modern world we live in. Yeah. To me, I just like, it's not enough to just point out things that like, that will sort of, I don't know, it's like a false intimacy with the reader that I think it's like, it's easy and it's boring to me.
And it dates it as well.
It dates it and it's frustrating. And I can feel the author like buddying up to me too much, and I know they're not trying to do that, but that's the effect it has. A bit when somebody is just sort of standing too close to you at a party, you know. and whereas I think actually it's you know, you want moments like that, like the one you just read from, of being like, yeah, we're all kind of romantic about ourselves as readers, but you also want things that are more uncomfortable, that like, you know, yes, these are things I've like a part of the Rachel instance I really like is that she does quite terrible things in that book to people who she loves, and things that are very unforgivable. But she says at a certain point, she was like, you know, are these terrible things? But like in the situation I was given, I think this was it was something, I think she said something like, in a situation so fucked, this was the only way I could unfuck myself. And she's quite comfortable with the terrible things she's done. And I'm prouder of those parts, I think, because they're not relatable, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Skip Shock, is it a standalone or is it the beginning of a new series?
Part 1 of 2.
Part 1 of 2.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
2-part story, yeah.
So are you working on part 2 now, or are you working on another novel, different type of novel?
I'm working on, it's a tough time because I'm working on the part 2, but I am also working on a TV show, which is the TV show of the Rachel Incident, which I'm writing myself. So I'm now a screenwriter and an executive producer as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So this would relate back to my original question. How do you do it all? And where is your brain in all of these different, like, for example, when you write fiction, are you sometimes thinking as a screenwriter?
I think so. Sometimes, yeah. I think for me, I never thought, you know, obviously when I was a kid I wanted to be a novelist, but when I grew up and I kind of found myself as a writer again, to me it was never format specific. It was always like I was a journalist when there was work to be a journalist. I was a novelist when there was work to be a novelist, and you know, and like I always wanted to be a screenwriter too. And I think my screenwriter side really comes out in my novels because I don't think there's any excuse to not have a propulsive plot. And have a visual plot as well. I think there's only so much time you can spend just in somebody's head, you know.
Caroline O'Donoghue, thank you so much for joining us on Shop
Elena.
Talk with Writers. Lovely to have you here.
See you in 7 years.
I hope not, but can I ask you to read a little bit for us?
Of course.
Which will,
just a couple of pages?
Whatever you like.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of pages, perfect.
I'll read from the start.
I wonder if you could read a bit of Moon and a bit of Margot.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, would that work?
So I'm going to give you a reading from both perspectives in the novel. Hopefully it will make sense. I'm going to begin with the prologue, which is from Moon's point of view. The most common response I get when I tell people what I do for a living is, I couldn't do a job like that. And what they mean is that they wouldn't do a job like this. Every so often, a new gruesome story circulates about salesmen and what travelling between time speeds does to one's physical health. We are twice as likely to be alcoholics, 3 times as likely to die by suicide, and infinitely more likely to disappear without anyone caring at all. But all I ever say is, you're right. You couldn't do a job like this. You couldn't haggle in a language you don't speak. You couldn't fall asleep anywhere, training your body to relish 15-minute-long seated naps in the middle of a busy market square. And you couldn't wake up the way we do. Salesmen wake up like dogs, snoring 1 second and barking at a stranger the next. So that was a little introduction to Moon's perspective. This is Margot, who, as you said, is in the third person. The school pushed for a therapist. Donna Ann agreed to it not because she believed in therapy, but because she wanted to impress upon Margot how serious this matter had become. She had, after all, sold the watch, and not just any watch, but Richard's watch. Donna Ann said it as though Margot had stolen from her mother directly, as if she had purposely severed her mother's last remaining tie and only out of spite. But Donna Ann had many things, including their house, to remember Richard by. Margot only had the watch. It was, technically speaking, hers to sell. The therapist suggested that Margot had depression. The therapist implied that it was something that was always cooking inside of Margot and even before the crash. That death had stirred up a nature that was naturally morose. Old school reports were summoned and then reviewed. Much was made of comments over her primary school years. Margot is content in her own company, read one. Margot often seems a little lost during group projects, came another. And this one, which felt slightly cruel on review, Margot has not left much of an impression on the other girls. He suggested that there was a link between this early Margot and the Margot who, aged 16, sold her father's watch, dyed her hair metallic red, and attempted to run away from home. He thought it was deeper than simply having a dead dad. He said that somewhere down the line and after more meetings, drugs might be helpful. For the moment, he said, he could only recommend breathing exercises.
Thank you so much. We've recorded this podcast once again with thanks to the hospitality of Brasserie Zadel in the amazing Crazy Cox room, where you can come and hear music or performances. And there's a little stage. So we've been sitting on a stage surrounded by, there's a deep red velvet curtain behind us, which says the Crazy Cox, and lots of tables. Also, as all of our podcasts, this one is accompanied by a piece that I write on my Substack about the author I interview. And that is Caroline O'Donoghue today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena.